Thank you for the invitation to speak today to the group from the UU Church. I've always enjoyed previous presentations I've had the opportunity to make, and look forward to some discussion. Thanks everyone for attending, and thank you particularly to Paul for reaching out and inviting me. I know the topic today is a big one. I mean, what's happening with migration, border enforcement, the policies of this administration, continuities and any changes from the last one. It's a vast topic. And what I wanted to do really was focus on something that often we don't know much about because it's not so much in the news, but I think it's really relevant. And that takes us geographically a little away from where we are right here in the borderlands to try and understand the root causes of migration, of why people leave. So I'm going to particularly focus on 3 countries, maybe add a little about another, but the 3 countries I want to talk about are Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, with some reference also to Nicaragua. And those countries have become important. They're often referred to, the first 3 anyway, as the Northern Triangle of Central American countries because of the geographical location and the recent rise in outmigration from those regions and the politics of this as it's playing out in the United States often refers now to people seeking asylum. So there's been something of a shift from maybe a couple of decades ago when the majority of migrants were seeking to enter the United States in search of economic opportunity and make claims based on those grounds. And now that is also still present, but I think we've seen more that the language of migration is of asylum and claims to asylum and the denial of asylum. So why are people leaving from these countries in Central America? And as a political scientist, my focus tends to be looking at the political factors, particularly government corruption, violence, repression, and impunity for the actions of governments. And because one big question often here, people say, why don't the migrants, asylum seekers, why don't they just stay in their home countries and organize and change things there? Why should the United States, in this case, or the European Union, in case of migration there, be responsible for providing a dignified life to people? Why don't they just figure out how to change laws and policies in their home countries? And that's an important question. And so what I'm going to try and do is try and address it as clearly as I can from what I've seen. And the bottom line often is that the political conditions to bring about progressive reforms in the countries that we've mentioned have not existed. There have been brief windows when maybe they have, but often those windows are too brief and closed down. And unfortunately, I think we're in a situation now where those windows are pretty closed. So I want to talk about that with some examples from recent politics in the region and the maybe raise a question of how the United States is also in some way responsible for those conditions, those political conditions of authoritarian governments, non-democratic governments, and a lack of spaces for people to organize and have their voice heard without facing violent repression in the process. And I bring this up, I'm going to share a screen in a second, but as you know, if you've been following the news, this administration, the Biden administration came in. One of the things they said it would do, which hadn't been heard so much under previous administrations, particularly under the Trump administration, was to address the root causes of migration from Central America and not to solely focus on other aspects. So this is somewhere in the agenda of US government policy towards the region right now. It's, I guess, a bit early days and it's quite unclear yet what exactly those policies will be, or how the United States government understands root causes, compared to how we may look at this a little more critically with some historical perspective. So I'm going to share the screen, if I can get down here. Okay, can you see that okay?
Yeah, you need to make, yeah, there it goes. That's good.
Okay. Okay, so I've titled this Corruption, Repression, and Impunity, Root Causes of Migration from Central America.
Yeah. Those are a lot of negative terms.
They are, unfortunately, but we'll see there's also opposition and efforts of reform and resistance to these things. So if we were to pose the question, or if you or I or any of us in your congregation, in your groups, in our community, were to be asked by people who maybe on the fence about US immigration policy, that see that people are suffering, but wondering how the United States should be coping with this, and we get asked, well, why don't they just stay home and fix the problems in their own countries? Sounds like a reasonable question to make if you don't know much about the region you're talking about. So if we were to be asked that, I think some of the things we have to keep in mind are, first of all, there's a long history of US interventionism in Central America, and that's benefited corporate interests from the United States for the most part. This goes back to the late 19th century, runs right through the 20th century, and I think still is present. And that's often been done in alliance with local oligarchies and dictatorial governments in the region, particularly during the Cold War period, that could claim to be a bulwark against communism in the way that the Cold War politics worked in Central America. And with that, there's been a long history of violent repression of opposition movements in Central America. This isn't just a recent thing, but particularly if we think in the 1980s, and for younger students who, of course, were born long after this is something new for them to learn about. But the way that the United States intervened to back the murderous regimes in El Salvador and Guatemala, and support for the Contra War against the Sandinista government in Nicaragua in the 1980s, also is important. Although it seems a long time ago, maybe 40 years, it's not that long. And one of the major impacts of that was to allow for the installation after the peace accords in the 1990s of governments which were very much without popular input. Much of the leadership of popular movements, peasant movements, labor unions have been physically removed from the political scene by those civil wars. In the 1990s, the US policies, both of the Democrats and the Republicans, whether it was Bush or Clinton, was to promote what was known as free trade or free trade agreements, to see, in their view, that the prosperity of Central America would be best served by allowing for greater amounts of foreign investment into the region, therefore reducing tariffs on trade, and to promote export-oriented agriculture and the creation of maquila or assembly plant zones in different Central American countries. At the same time, in the post-war period in the 1990s, and we get into the 2000s, I think we've seen the rise of elected governments. Now it's no longer the militaries that are intervening to take control directly as they had done from the 1930s through to the 1980s, but now with democracy seen as the sole form of government around the world that can establish any basis of international recognition and legitimacy. So elections are being held in each of these countries, but they tend to be very corrupt and fraudulent elections that have allowed for authoritarian forms of government to come into office, using the trappings of democracy at the same time. So we have something of a hybrid here that defies many political science predictions of democratization occurring easily throughout Latin America or in post-authoritarian settings. And I think we also see this in parts of Eastern Europe. When you look at Poland and Hungary today, of really authoritarian governments in which executive power, the power of the presidency, is bolstered over, particularly over that of the judicial branch. So this means that people have a hard time in these countries of appealing to the rule of law, to protection of basic civil and human rights, the right to assembly, the right of a free press, if they're critical of government policies of the day. So there's little balance here then between the executive branch and the judiciary, and the legislative branch has often been subordinated also to the executive. In that case, we have the opportunity is rife for corruption if members of the ruling party, those close to the president, are allowed to have impunity and they know they can act with impunity and use repression against those brave souls who do go out on the streets and demonstrate and protest against this. And so that's where I want to really home in this presentation on corruption and repression as being root causes of the outmigration that we're seeing from the Northern Triangle of Central America today. I know that's a lot, but that might be a quick answer to anyone. If you do get stopped in the street or in Albertsons any particular time, break into a conversation with friends or Thanksgiving table, you know, why are people coming? Why don't they just stay home and do this? Well, yeah, I think we have some elements here to answer that kind of question in an honest way. And I think it's also been recognized by the Biden administration, at least on paper, and even in some action since the start of this year. In July of this year, after a period of mulling this over, the administration came out with what it calls its root causes strategy. And it's composed of 5 different elements. One, as we might imagine, is to address economic issues, the economic insecurity and inequality in Central America. Secondly, is the one I find interesting. I think this would be rife for more research, more in-depth research on what actually the United States is capable of doing or willing to do to help combat corruption, strengthen democratic governance, and promote the rule of law. Some way that's tied to number 3, to promote respect for human rights, particularly labor rights and press freedom. And this is also tied to 4, to combat and prevent violence and extortion and other crimes by gangs, drug cartels, human traffickers, and so on. And finally, the root causes strategy recognizes that much of the violence is gender-based and it's directed particularly towards women. And so these are things that are included in a very recent document and would merit further discussion. Maybe we can get to that at the end. But what is the reality in Central America that this root causes strategy is referring to? I'm going to go country by country, Guatemala first, then Honduras, Nicaragua, and El Salvador. In the 1980s, the Guatemalan military, led in the early 80s by a general by the name of Efraín Ríos Montt, who was head of state in 82 to 83, engaged in what many have called genocide against the Mayan population of northern Guatemala, particularly in the Ixil region. It's an estimated 200,000 people lost their lives at the hands of the Guatemalan military, mostly civilian indigenous people who were accused of being sympathizers for one of the main armed guerrilla movements that was active in those years. There are several documentaries on this, and I include at the end of this slide, of this presentation, some readings as well, if you wanted to read a bit more about this period. But the Guatemalan government under the military tried to conclude the military phase by in some way copying what had happened in Vietnam, the creation of what they called civil patrols that were under military command and that were used in counterinsurgency, and to move people from the villages that had just been razed to the ground. Around 300 small rural villages were just taken off the map in the space of 18 months under Ríos Montt and resettled in what were known as development poles, which were entirely dependent on the military for any kind of economic livelihood. in Guatemala, the post-war period, when we get to the 1990s, I know I'm jumping a bit here, is marked by some continuities with that, because there was never really justice for the actions of the military in the 1980s and that genocide that occurred. Instead, the post-mid-1990s peace accords scenario was filled often by the rise of organized crime. I think this is often the case around the world in post-Civil War conflicts. There are many weapons still around in the countries. New interests emerge that seek to take advantage of weak state presence and weak institutions, certainly weak rule of law and corruption. And organized crime really got a foothold in Guatemala in the late 1990s and 2000s. And what we see is throughout the 2000s, the lines between state officials, including military officers and criminal organizations, become really blurred. And this is where many people in Guatemala started to mobilize on the streets and call for anti-corruption investigations to try and bring to light how it was that the institutions of government, which were now in this post-war period, attempting in some way to create greater stability and a more peaceful and prosperous future for Guatemalans, how those same institutions were already being infiltrated by criminal organizations. So at the core of the issue in Guatemala has been impunity, because that impunity for the past crimes weakens the ability of the justice system to investigate current crimes. Out of these protests, and there's a photograph here, Yo Amo CICIG. CICIG is, as you'll see in a moment, the name of the anti-corruption, anti-impunity commission that was set up in Guatemala in 2007 through an agreement with the United Nations. And the CICIG came out of those popular mobilizations. People weren't just, crossing their arms and staying at home and apathetically accepting the status quo. Guatemalans have been and are really very active in seeking an end to impunity and corruption, which, as I think I've tried to mention, could be seen as causes of desperation and migration that we're seeing today. So people have been active in trying to do this. And they had some success. The creation of the CICIG in late 2006 began its work in 2007, led to investigation and bringing to trial of many government officials for corruption, and also uncovered the illegal dealings of a former president who was in power from 2008 to 2012, President Perez Molina, to 2015, who was forced to resign towards the end of his government. So this was something that did have an important impact in calling for cleaner government in the case of Guatemala. The person in this picture is Claudia Passi. She's won many international awards and recognition for her work in favoring human rights in Guatemala. And during the presidency of Alvaro Colom in Guatemala from 2008 to 2012, she was appointed Attorney General actually at the end of 2010. And she came out of the human rights movement in Guatemala. She'd worked closely with the Catholic Diocese of Guatemala City and with the main independent investigation into what went on with the genocide in the 1980s. She worked closely with Bishop Juan Harvey, who in 1998 was assassinated just 2 days after publishing its report, the diocese report, on military human rights violations in the 80s. So she came out of that history, and it's something, you might say, well, that was an advance in Guatemala that a president would appoint as Attorney General of the country someone with that kind of background out of the human rights movement. And she has been, I was referring to before, these brief windows of possibility to address impunity. I think this was a brief window between 2010 and May of 2014, when she was unconstitutionally removed from her position as AG. She was able to increase by over 30% the number of convictions of criminal organizations. She helped dismantle some of the most violent ones. She brought to justice leaders of Los Zetas in Guatemala, which is no small thing for anyone who's heard of Los Zetas in Mexico and the kind of violent history they have there. She also helped bring to trial military officials responsible for the genocide in the 1980s, including General Efraín Ríos Montt, who we saw earlier at a meeting with Ronald Reagan. Ríos Montt was charged, but the Constitutional Court overturned the charges. Before a retrial could take place, Ríos Montt died, and so Ríos Montt was never actually brought to justice. But that effort earned, as we might expect, a lot of pushback from the traditional oligarchy in Guatemala, which led to the removal of Claudia Passi from her position about 6 months before it was due to actually end in 2014. There's a wonderful documentary on this I would recommend called Burden of Peace. If any of you have access to the NMSU library, you can see it there quite easily for free. It's also, I'm sure, available on other platforms, but look out for Burden of Peace. It was produced in 2015, shortly after Claudia was removed from her position. So there's a brief window, and it pretty much closed with that. In relation to that brief window, the successor of the president who had was forced to resign, Otto Pérez Molina, his successor, President Jimmy Morales, once the CICIG tried to investigate him and people close to him for corruption, they moved quickly to end CICIG's presence in Guatemala, and that occurred in 2019. Since then, there's been a purge of anti-corruption prosecutors led by the new Attorney General, Consuelo Porras, who's still the Attorney General now. And Porras is a very close friend of the current president, Giammattei, in the photograph here, who's also alleged as a recipient of bribes from Russian businessmen right now. So are we talking in Guatemala of anti-corruption measures or anti-corruption or pro-corruption? I think right now it looks more the latter, unfortunately. But there was that brief window, and it means that civil society organizations, protest movements in Guatemala are still active in seeking change in their own country. And the purging of the justice system in Guatemala has continued under the current president. Just this year, Juan Francisco Sandoval, who is co-worker with Claudia Passi and with CICIG, was fired from his position in the Office of the Special Prosecutor Against Impunity. Hilda Pineda, another top prosecutor, brought Ríos Montt to trial in 2013, was also removed just last month from her position. And this has led to street protests in Guatemala, which, you know, Guatemalans see this again, that opportunity to bring about transparency in government, justice, an end to impunity seems to be closed down right now. Juan Francisco Sandoval is currently seeking asylum in the United States. If we turn to Honduras, recent history there includes a coup against then elected President Manuel Zelaya in 2009. He was removed from office, and a caretaker government came in for a couple of years. New elections were held, and it's led to the administration of Juan Orlando Hernandez, or JOH, as the initials go. Again, because of popular pressure during his first government, there was a movement to try and create a similar anti-corruption, anti-impunity commission as we saw in Guatemala. In other words, to create an Honduran window for anti-corruption measures. The Organization of American States, not the UN in this case, was the one that sponsored something called the Mission to Support the Fight Against Corruption and Impunity in Honduras, or MASIC, which began its work in April of 2016. So the Orlando Hernandez government accepted its presence and has consistently tried to oppose it, and eventually closed it down in January of 2020. The Orlando Hernandez government is alleged to have taken bribes from drug traffickers and even used the military to protect cocaine traffickers. His brother has been accused and put in a US prison for drug trafficking. One of the current candidates in the upcoming elections next Sunday in Honduras served 3 times in a US prison, 3 years in a US prison for money laundering related to drug trafficking. Also concerning Honduras, a new penal code passed by the Orlando Hernandez government has reduced the sentences for corruption and for drug trafficking crimes. And investigations that were supported by this mission while it was in existence had identified 14 officials of the Social Security Institute in Honduras with embezzlement. All 14 officials were acquitted, and despite the fact that there was evidence that around $90 million of Honduran Social Security funds were provided illegally to the election campaign in 2013 of Orlando Hernandez. So I said next Sunday, you'll see this somewhere in the news. I hope there'll be some coverage. There will be presidential elections in Honduras. And these are really vital, I think, for the future of Honduras, regardless of whether anyone's concern is with migration from Honduras or not, but simply for Honduran people. I mentioned earlier there was a coup in 2009 against Manuel Zelaya. He was a reformer in the Liberal Party of Honduras, kind of a moderate reformer, not very radical, but too radical for the Conservative National Party and the military supporters that they had, that brought in Orlando Hernandez. Since 2009, we've seen the Conservative National Party in power right until today. So that's what, 12 years of that party in power under, since 2013, a government that was elected, widespread allegations of fraud in 2013, but it elected Orlando Hernandez. He managed to have the constitution reformed, which allowed him to run for re-election in 2017. And actually, ironically, one of the reasons that the National Party and the military used in their coup against Manuel Zelaya was that they thought Zelaya wanted to change the constitution so he could run for re-election for president. So that, of course, Orlando Hernandez then comes in 2013, gets the constitution from so he can run for re-election for president. And the election of 2017 was probably the worst and most fraudulent of all in Honduran history. And with a violent crackdown on protesters, you can see in the photograph here, was a big banner saying, "Fuera JOH, Juan Orlando Hernandez, out, narco dictador," narco dictator. There were calls for new elections from the OAS, from the Organization of American States, but in the end, the results were allowed to stand, and in part thanks to the support from President Trump to those elections and their outcome. But many people were hurt in that there was a lot of violent repression, which I think has also something to do with the outmigration that we're seeing from Honduras in most recent years. So next Sunday's election, keep an eye open for this. This is really important because for the first time, it's possible that the National Party will lose power since the 2009 coup. The opposition coalition known as Libre has a candidate, Xiomara Castro. She would be the first female president of Honduras. Currently, she's ahead in the polls, but because of an alliance she was able to make with the more centrist center-left. So this is kind of a center-left reformist option for Honduras. Castro herself is the wife of Manuel Zelaya, so they go back a ways. And as I say, they're leading currently about 15 points in the polls as we go into the election next week. But the big question is, if Castro comes close to winning, will the government respect the results, or will it resort to a crackdown or fraud on the day? So big things happening in Honduras, and I do believe that this kind of history of the lack of justice, the impunity, the corruption, particularly the narco influence in Honduras, is driving people out. So if someone to ask you, why can't the people just stay in Honduras and fix their problems there? Well, these people in the photograph are trying to do that, but as you can see, it ain't easy. Nicaragua. 2 weeks ago, there were elections in Nicaragua, which most observers have called a farce. The victor was Daniel Ortega of the Frente Sandinista, and his wife and Vice President Rosario Murillo. You can see in the picture there with the picture of Sandino himself in the background, Sandino being a major figure in Nicaragua's history. He was the leader of a guerrilla force against the US Marines in the 1920s, and it was killed by the forces that the Marines left in place, the National Guard led by the Somoza family. But they're claiming an allegiance still to Sandino as the Frente Sandinista, or Sandinista Front of National Liberation. So Ortega's been re-elected, and this is another, I think, example of elected authoritarianism, to a fourth 5-year term in power. He's been in power since 2007. And to do this, his government's arrested during this year, since April, 7 opposition leaders. So the FSLM went into the election knowing there'd be no serious competition. There were other candidates of very small minor parties, but the major opposition were all rounded up and is currently in jail under various charges. So many have seen this election with a very low turnout of around 20%, according to some independent observers. So the government itself claimed it won 75% of the vote for Ortega. And this comes in the context of serious crackdowns on protests since 2018, as Ortega has not been conducive to negotiation of policy issues, particularly reform of the pension system, which is demanding that workers pay more and employees pay less into pension systems. The initial protests were around that, but the violent repression by the police sparked new protests against the nature of the government, not just the pension issue. And that those protests have continued somewhat, but there's also been people fleeing Nicaragua because the political conditions to bring about reform simply do not exist. So we've seen movement from politicians, journalists, human rights activists in exile. Around 140,000 Nicaraguans have fled to Costa Rica since 2018. Interestingly, Nicaragua was never really on the radar as far as migration to the Mexico-US border in the way that Guatemala is or Honduras. But that's changed this past year, going from just a few thousand in prior years. Now we're seeing more Nicaraguans arriving at the border as well, 50,000 in 2021 so far. So this is to do with this kind of repression that I mentioned, particularly in 2018 and since. In the 2018 protests, around 300 protesters were killed by police and many more were arrested. Observers thought that was the lowest point for the Ortega's legitimacy until today, when I think we may have reached an even lower point with the sham election. So in none of these countries that we've mentioned, Guatemala, Honduras, or Nicaragua, could we say that there are political conditions conducive to people organizing peacefully and bringing about the necessary reforms to improve living standards and have a voice in policy decisions. We've seen the election of authoritarian governments, often with the backing from the United States. This is a protest movement, and for anyone who remembers the promise of the Sandinista revolution in the early 1980s, this is something of a great disappointment when you see a poster having a picture of Ortega and the former dictator Somoza in the same picture. Ortega y Somoza son la misma cosa. But also, to go back to Paul's point, we need some kind of basis for thinking of, well, people react to these situations. They don't necessarily give up. There have been and continue to be strong social movements against the authoritarianism in Nicaragua of the Ortegas. I'm going to turn to El Salvador and then conclude. So El Salvador is also one of the three countries that form the Northern Triangle. When we often hear that phrase, it's Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. In 2019, Nayib Bukele was elected. He did not come from either of the two main traditional major parties in El Salvador, Arena on the right and the AN on the left. But instead, I think, as we've seen in many countries in the world, was able to garner support from people who are fed up with the traditional parties and saw an outsider, in this case, fairly right-wing business leader. This should, familiar story. I can see you nodding and thinking through, okay, we've seen the story before. Bukele is very authoritarian, more from the right, I would say, and has been ignoring basically whatever the US has done since Biden came in. One of the things it mentioned or included was a list of corrupt officials that it wanted Central American governments to investigate. It had evidence on from US investigations and other international bodies. So Bukele has very, maybe predictably, ignored that list completely because they only included those in his own governments and he wasn't going to go after them. Instead, he's gone after former officials of the FMLN party who were in power immediately prior to him without due process and thrown them in jail, claiming this is part of anti-corruption efforts at work in El Salvador. The authoritarian turn in El Salvador under Bukele is also revealed earlier this year when the Attorney General and 5 Supreme Court justices were fired by the legislative branch in May of this year. They happened to be investigating pandemic-related corruption of the Bukele government. Many analysts call this a self-coup, when you basically dissolve the judicial branch and stack it with your own people. And so the legislative branch is totally behind Bukele. There's no opposition there. Bukele brought in the military into a sitting session of the House, equivalent to the House of Representatives, to force legislators or to intimidate legislators to vote in favor of his policies, which are to militarize the police in the fight against drug trafficking in El Salvador. There was some opposition to that because of Salvador's history with military rule. But those opposition voices were pretty much intimidated when you have to vote and you've got soldiers standing at the back of the aisle at your assembly meeting. There was an International Commission Against Impunity in El Salvador, known as the CICES. So as we saw in Guatemala, the CICIG, all these different acronyms. In Honduras, there was also one, the mission that's been closed down, and also maybe somewhat predictably as well, this was even shorter lived than the others. In El Salvador, shortly after Bukele was elected, the CICES worked with the Organization of American States to investigate corruption and impunity. And that was terminated, that contract, in June of this year. So CICES, in the International Commission Against Impunity in El Salvador, no longer has any presence, which is really scary. A bit like in Nicaragua and in Guatemala and in Honduras. The only ray of hope I see in all of that would be if Castro were to win in next Sunday's elections in Honduras. But if you look at Nicaragua and Ortega, what Bukele's doing in El Salvador, who's also able to change legislation to allow him to run for re-election again in 2024. The purging of anti-corruption prosecutors in Guatemala, such that some of them have to seek asylum in exile. It's not a pretty picture. It's not very conducive to people staying at home and fixing their own problems. But people still try. So there are protests, and this is a picture of one protester calling Bukele a dictator and calling for him to leave El Salvador. So a lot of this then does spill over into the migration issue of why people leave. At the southern border of Mexico is where many of these issues first manifest themselves, even before they manifest themselves in Del Rio or El Paso. And this year, it was calculated at around 55,000 asylum seekers from the Northern Triangle countries, as well as from Haiti and further afield, Brazil and Ecuador, in Tapachula, which is a mid-sized city on the border of Chiapas in southern Mexico with Guatemala. It's like the main port of entry if people seeking to flee, obviously, towards the United States. There was also denounced there the corruption of Mexican authorities in the sale of humanitarian visas. They were fetching up to $5,000 each for those who could somehow afford that. The Mexican National Institute for Migration was denying, and still is denying, the right of these people to leave Tapachula to find work elsewhere in Mexico. And that's why we see, sorry, it's a typo here, migrant caravans, which have sought to walk, and there's one walking right now from southern Mexico all the way to the United States. In this case, the caravan is hoping or calling for a meeting with the Mexican president of Mexico City at the National Palace. But these caravans are violently broken up by police, by Mexico's militarized National Guard, because I think the Mexican government is doing the dirty work of the United States government in Mexico by seeking to prevent a problem for the US administration by restricting the flow of migrants from Central America as far north as where we are. The migrant caravans have also been calling for dialogue, but often that dialogue is not happening. Dialogue would mean allowing for the speeding up of providing humanitarian visas so people could stay in Mexico and find work and figure out what to do next, but still be able to move beyond Tapachula and beyond the state of Chiapas. And there's a video link there. I won't show it now, but I'll send Paul the slides later and you can watch it, of how these migrants have been treated in recent weeks and months. So I want to conclude on a couple of things. I wasn't really able in this presentation to talk so much about the economic issues. One that I would like to bring up are the environmental crises and hunger in Central America. There have been periods of drought in many of the Central American countries, which have led to decline in agricultural production, people unable to feed themselves, being forced into migration to shanty towns around the big cities like San Pedro Sula in Honduras or Tegucigalpa, where often they're preyed upon by criminal gangs in cahoots with government officials. The World Food Programme has estimated that one of the main reasons for migration, based on their research, is increasing hunger, particularly in Guatemala. So when you have all of these problems occurring at the same time, lack of economic opportunity, the impact of climate change, the droughts, as well as terrible hurricanes. This time last year, there were 2 major hurricanes that hit the Atlantic coast of Honduras. Mudslides, the destruction of infrastructure, roads, bridges, makes it extremely difficult for people to just stay and continue to make a living where they are. And perhaps if there was a political will within each of these countries to assist and to provide opportunities for people to stay and rebuild those communities, things may be a little different, but that, I think, as we've seen, is not the current reality. Another reality, another world is possible, and I think that has to do with social movements in Central America organizing in the defense of indigenous and rural lands and food sovereignty to shift the economic model away from export-oriented agriculture towards production of goods for self-sustenance within the communities of Central American countries in an ecological way. Certainly the protection and promotion of democratic rights and an end to corruption. And that's where I think we need more global solidarity. And what we're seeing here, these are struggles for life against oblivion. And it's not just here, we see on the eastern end of Europe or the Mediterranean, the crossings from Africa, people are really struggling just simply to survive these days. There are some websites here you can also look to if you're interested in following up with grassroots initiatives in southern Mexico and Central America. There's some background reading here. I particularly recommend the first one by Chomsky, Central America's Forgotten History. It just came out this year, so it brings in a lot of these connections of root causes of migration. And the last article there is on the recent election in Nicaragua and what that implies for the future of that country. And then I know I've spoken a lot about anti-corruption efforts, these different programs like the Commission in Guatemala, the Mission in Honduras, and the Center in El Salvador, none of which exist anymore, which is interesting to know. So there's some articles there from the Washington Office on Latin America, an independent policy analysis group, which I think is one of my go-to sources for a lot of this information. And I also included the US government, the White House's briefing room statement on its strategy to address the root causes if you wanted to look into that a bit more. And finally, we are here in Las Cruces, so a wonderful NMSU library has subscriptions to something called latinnews.com. If you wanted to follow the news from different parts of Latin America, the subscription is to the weekly reports and regional reports. And our Center for Latin American and Border Studies also has an ongoing program of events and speakers that Paul, we were just talking about, is a long history, of course, in our university. So with that, I'll finish and open up for questions.
Well, thank you very much, Neil. It's a very comprehensive problem. Questions, comments, anyone?
Neil, in talking about impunity as being a root cause, and it is, how do we in the United States deal with the impunity allowed in other countries? You know, it seems to me that the Biden administration so far think that if they just put a lot of money into the countries that will solve the problems. But impunity is an ongoing problem. It's getting worse. And people are scared to stay because it doesn't do any good.
Right, and that's what we hear often. People are seeking asylum and are denied. As we know, the denial rate for asylum seekers is very, very high, and that's the trend that we're seeing. There's really a closing down of that. And often this is directly to do with impunity. I was on a webinar a couple of weeks ago, organized by the Academy for Learning in Retirement here. And Nancy Aretskin was talking about this as well. And I've seen some readings on it. Many of the people seeking asylum don't have on file with them or aren't able to bring with them a report that they may have filed with the police in Guatemala, for example, about the violence against them and why they can't stay there, what's happened. And judges say, well, if you don't have any piece of paper from the police that they were investigating your case, and obviously they didn't, and that's why you're here, we're going to send you back. So judges, and I think the broader public, just need to know some of these conditions, why people do not go to the police because the police are also part of the problem, right? And that doesn't minimize the claim for asylum. It shouldn't. And it's a big problem we have to work with and provide testimony and expert witness and just be really engaged, I think, with the asylum system here to certainly reform it, to overcome all of the current tendency to close it down. I think that's one thing we can do here, and it is being done to some extent. Regarding what can be done internally, I think, you know, there's some things that shouldn't be done to begin with, the do's and don'ts. One, I think it was a mistake of the Trump administration to recognize the election in 2017 of Juan Orlando Hernandez and his government to minimize the depth of the crisis there, the repression of opponents. It could have supported the OAS call for new elections to be held. I think there's also a need to be supportive of these independent commissions, the anti-corruption commissions, these little windows, which would require some kind of alliance between the grassroots movements in these countries and people in the United States, pushing the US government to say, yes, we need to have these independent commissions allowed to do their work and not be just, you know, closed down or manipulated in the way that we're seeing. But it's a contradiction, which I'm sure you're aware of, Jan, that in many of these cases, the priority for the US has often been, how do we protect US for investment, corporate investment in these countries? We don't want to upset Ortega or Bukele or Orlando Hernandez or the guy in Guatemala, Jemate. If something bad happens, then all these millions of dollars and products that we extract, minerals, foods, clothing by cheap labor, will be lost. So there's a huge contradiction between neoliberal economics and democracy, I see. Right now, it's become glaringly obvious. I always thought it was present in the early 90s, but then the dominant narrative was that things go together. Capitalism, democracy, all boats rise, and et cetera, et cetera. But that is certainly not the case. And instead, we have this very dark situation, I think, in Central America for people to find a way to reform their systems and to allow for redistribution of wealth, greater prosperity so people could stay.
I know that Costa Rica has been a real success, and I've been there, and even when I was with the World Bank, we had interactions with them. Can't they see how well Costa Rica has done, and and maybe they could do the same?
Of course they see that, but we also see the histories of their countries, and the histories of the countries are very different, I think, for at least two major reasons. One, in Costa Rica, we never saw the development of a landed oligarchy with huge estates and very big difference between the very elite members or families of the country and the massive poor peasants that we see, say, in Guatemala. Instead, the nature of Costa Rica's economic development, I think, has been more egalitarian, without being completely so, of course. There's still oligarchy there, but you didn't see the extremes of land, particularly land. I think the agrarian question is central here. Land concentration in Costa Rica that you see elsewhere. So coffee production doesn't necessarily require huge, large estates that are controlled by.
Our hand went away.
There are many small coffee growers you're probably aware of, Paul, maybe some of the things you've seen in Central America elsewhere. But if they're not allowed opportunity to prosper, then they're used as mainly cheap labor, which is the case in Guatemala. But I think the longer period of economic developments in Costa Rica led to less.
Neil, you're muted somehow.
Neil.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know how that happened. So I'll say, well, two factors. One, in Costa Rica, I don't think you see the same level of economic inequality historically. So it's really difficult to say for Guatemala to do that right now. Certainly the business elite in Guatemala doesn't care about equality at all. It's a bad idea. In Costa Rica, it's been part of the social history. The second part, I think, is Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, particularly have supported the models, the very unequal nature of the societies with the power of the military. The armed forces has played a central political role in those countries. Even in the post-peace period, the post-peace accords periods in Guatemala, the military is still very much a big player in the scenes and owns a lot of property, a lot of land that was taken over from the communities in the 80s. They're not about to give that up. Costa Rica abolished the military in 1948. There's, I think, benefited both politically from that. It's been more stable. It hasn't had the military to turn to or intervene of its own accord throughout the Cold War, as it was in the rest of Central America. And also economically, a bunch of money if you're not spending on military and weapons. I mean, who's going to invade Costa Rica? But then again, who's going to invade Guatemala? Why do they need so much money for the armed forces or El Salvador buying these jets? It's crazy to me, but I can understand it from the point of view, when you look at the history of the countries of why. So fortunately for Costa Ricans, they haven't had that kind of economic inequality and they haven't had the military on top of them.
Yeah. Anybody else? Comment. Go ahead, David.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Harvey, for your presentation. It's very interesting. It's also very sobering. And, you know, I wonder to what extent our own country's difficulties and slide towards an authoritarian orientation is undermining any efforts that we might make to intervene in a positive way to you know, to undercut the root causes of the problems that are, you know, driving people away from those countries.
Yeah, I would agree. It doesn't make it easier. The United States can be seen as less of this beacon of democracy, if it ever was that, you know. But that was the narrative that was dominant after the end of the Cold War, that the United States would be there to help countries democratize and would provide assistance for not militaries anymore, but for the judicial system to be reformed, for civil society organizations, for press freedom, for labor rights, and so on. And I think has a very spotty record on it, but that at least was the narrative. Now, when you have the Republican Party, many not accepting the results of the 2020 election still. I heard the other day that the leader of the Republican Party she said in an interview that now she says Biden really is the president, but it took a long time for it to get there. And there's a lot, including, I think, our own congressional District 2 representative who still is not convinced that the election was free and fair. So how can the United States turn around and call on other countries to hold free and fair elections after all the shenanigans over the past 12 months?
And have independent commissions. we can't have an independent commission.
No, but we still have a reputation. We don't deserve it, but we have it. And the world looks to us for that type of thing. I don't understand it because, well, we see it up close and we know that we don't deserve that reputation. But I'll tell you, the immigrants that are coming here just think we are wonderful. They can hardly wait to get here with all the freedoms.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, but also the lack of being hunted down by the police and, you know, all that kind of stuff, you know, and being able to have a job and all those things. Yeah. Anyone else, please? Question, comment.
Going back to the point about how the United States may not have the same kind of leverage that it thinks it had or thinks that it should have. There are other efforts, I think, in the United States as well as other countries, more non-governmental efforts from regular folks, you know, who are aware of this, provide support and solidarity, not really expecting our governments to move a whole lot. When, you know, Biden came in, there was this expectation, okay, there'd be a different approach to immigration, but I think we're a bit disappointed by that. So it comes back in the end to regular folks, you know. But I think that doesn't help when the United States itself cannot present an unhypocritical stance in promotion of human rights or democracy when we see, you know, the way the police has been used in this country against Black Lives Matter protests or so on. It really is an issue there of whether the United States wants to do that anyway these days. But I think for many in Central America, Jan is right. You know, they would still see getting to the US as the goal. And that it has to be better than where they are. And they're prepared to really risk their lives, as we're seeing in making that trek.
Anyone else? Comment, question? Interest? Anyone?
Charlie.
Go ahead, Charlie.
Charlie. Muted.
Unmute, Charlie.
Yeah, go ahead. Did you have a comment, question? Yeah. Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
You're muted, Charlie.
Yeah. You're muted. Yeah, he doesn't.
Unmute my audio. Okay.
Hey!
How about that? Yeah, I'm curious. Do you think that the average populace in any of these four countries really thinks of us as they really want our help, or they just want to come over here and get out of there?
Well, it's pretty clear right now, most have given up on the US really helping the situation where they live, and they're getting out in thousands, you know. So there hasn't been like a slowdown of migration because they've seen really significant steps taken to end impunity or to help anti-corruption prosecutors stay in their jobs, or allow for elections to be held, which would provide more possibility for reforms. So right now, I guess there's not a lot of expectation towards what the US is willing to do. When Kamala Harris went there, she said, yeah, we're concerned about corruption and we'll do something in that area. And it's good to say. But as we've seen, Bukele and El Salvador just turns out this list, all these people are fine because they're with me. But these people from the previous governments, okay, you want to hear about anti-corruption? So they're in jail now. And what does the US do? Well, says that, well, we don't agree with that. There's a lot of money tied up as well if the US were to pose sanctions on Bukele, as it has done in Venezuela or Cuba for way too long, in my opinion. That would probably hurt the Salvadoran economy, would probably produce more out-migration, as well as hurting US investment. So there's a whole kind of knot of contradictions, isn't there, of how the US wants to really act in Central America.
All right.
Yeah. Anyone else? Well, go ahead, Annette.
Dave, it seems like you have mentioned that those countries use a lot of military and police to keep their people in check. But that costs a lot of money because the police and the military is not necessarily made up of people that support the government, you know, politically. I mean, those people are made up of just everyday people. So you're going to have to pay them a lot to be on your side. So where does this money come from? Those countries don't have that much economic power. I mean, I don't see products in the store that says made in El Salvador, made in Honduras, you know? So they have to get, the governments have to get loans from other countries, especially for the equipment that these militaries and police are equipped with, besides the, you know, the wages that they're being paid. So does the United States have a hand in that? I mean, do they give them money and then that money is spent on the military industrial complex in the United States? Is that like a, you know, kind of little circle going on here?
Yeah, along with this complicated knot is the war on drugs, which has been in place since, what, 1969 from the US? And that has brought in funds to ostensibly reduce the flow of drugs from Central America, wherever, Mexico. Most of that has gone to military and police, law enforcement, really, rather than addressing the root causes of that issue as well. It's another part of the knot, right? That has been really the tendency since, particularly since around 2000. So a lot of these institutions, which are really beyond accountability, the military in Guatemala, certainly, as we saw what happened to Claudia Passi, and the militarized police, which has become more militarized over the years, depends on weaponry and training. And the US is a big partner in that, not the only one, but it is a big because that is also part of the general US national policy, whether it's Democrat or Republican in the White House, to appear tough on drug trafficking. And so what the most obvious way that has occurred to those policymakers has been to strengthen law enforcement. El Salvador right now is pretty much, I think, almost like a police state in, as far as that goes. Under Bukele, the whole strategy has been built on almost, you know, identifying certain territories within the country in which the militarized police is permanently placed. But like we saw in Mexico under Calderon, you know, he sent the military out to Michoacan and then up to Juarez, and we know what happened from that. Just a lot of people got killed in the process. It has never really resolved the flow of drugs or the issue. Why? Because these same institutions are beyond accountability. They're not being held accountable in the way that they should for the funding and the resources that they get. There's been a lack of political will, I think, from the United States in providing this funding year after year to do anything differently. So in a way, I think those countries or those authoritarian leaders play the United States as well in this. It's kind of a two-way street. You know, oh, great, the gringos, I've got lots of money. They don't like drugs, apparently. Actually, they do, but they say they don't. So let's suck some funds out for our military and our police and our buddies and our government, and we'll be happy. It's not like they're about to be cut off, are they?
Well, it's getting towards the end. We're a little bit beyond. In case somebody has a really good question or comment, we'll call it quits. Anyone? So let's give our speaker a big hand.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's been an excellent program.
Thank you, Paul. Everybody.
Yeah. And next week, we're going to have Amanda Askin, our Donut County clerk, and talk about elections in our country and some of the issues that she had. And I'm sure she'll talk about what's going on nationally also. So it should be a really informed discussion, and I'm looking forward to it. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Bob.
Good night.
Thank you.